what do we refer to when we talk about epistemology, and why is it the epistemological reflections something important for us human beings to take into account and to focus on?
When we talk about epistemology, we are inviting to reflect on the fundaments from which one says what one says, either as a grounding for the reflection or as a validation for what one is saying. So in that sense, epistemology is very fundamental in philosophy and science, because it refers precisely to where I am standing in space, thinking, and time when I am speaking or saying what I am saying. That's to what refers epistemology.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the epistemological domain of reflections when we do science reveals to us the criteria by which we claim that something is valid or not.
Exactly. For example, science, the fundament of science, hence the epistemological fundamentals, is that its theme is explaining what is happening in the living when one is reflecting about a question. Because one reflects about the experience that the question evokes. And this will be with one kind of fundament or another, according to the reflections of the person that is going to answer.
And in that sense, the question that we would be posing, it will be, how do we know what we know?
Could be that, how do we know what we know, or what we know refers to what? For example, traditionally, the purpose is understanding reality. And we know from biology that we are structure-determined systems, and so we cannot talk about reality as an independent entity that one looks at. And we discover that reality has to do with what we do. And so that is an epistemological shift that is very fundamental, because it means that I'm not going to talk about something independent of me, even when I am doing science, but I'm going to talk about what happens to me in certain circumstances. What is the experience which I'm going to explain when I do science, not what is the reality where I'm going to make hypotheses about what it is. It's a different thing.
And it's interesting because if it is so, when we have epistemological questions or epistemological reflections, we don't get into a universal truth or to a proper or improper response. The purpose of an epistemological reflections is to reveal the space from which each one of us is standing.
Yes, and then what will constitute for this, from that perspective, a valid statement, a truth? The truth becomes a valid statement in the circumstances in which it is made.
And I understand and I see how this operates on the scientific domain when we are making scientific explanations. And for example, in our daily living, for someone who is not a scientist, where or how can a person identify or enter an epistemological reflection in their daily living?
Well, the person, we can ask, how do you know? And the person either will say, well, this is scientific truth, and puts this outside of his authority. Or this is answer saying, well, if you do this and this and this and this, you obtain that. And this is put in the domain of daily life experience of the person. So the person and his or her doings will constitute the epistemological fundament for the explanation. This is what we do, for example, in the book History of Our Daily Living. That is the fundament, the epistemological fundament is daily living.
Mm. Interesting. So, in that sense, all of us, human beings, whether we notice or not, in different moments of our living, we enter into epistemological reflections or question, even though we may not name it like that.
Exactly. And daily life is the fundament for most of our explanation, certainly for all science, unless we suppose there is an independent reality. But what we do occurs in our daily living. If I'm, for example, thinking in the discovery of the satellites of Jupiter, how do you do this? Well, you produce certain instruments, like the telescope, and you wait to certain day of the week, and you or in the night, and so you do certain things in your daily living. And if you do them in a particular way, you see the satellites of Jupiter.
And that is interesting because it also brings us back to connect that the epistemological domain or the epistemological questions are always intrinsically connected to the realization of the living of each human being and each living being, and that by staying together and living together with others, we have the capacity to expand our the epistemological reflections or insights that we may get.
Yes, yes. For example, when Galileo observed this and made the telescope, he would say, look through the telescope. And the telescope, of course, is an instrument and does what it is designed to do in our daily living. Are you speaking about reality there? Well, because I think that there, and this is an epistemological answer, yes, I think there is a reality. But to see this reality, you have to do this and this and that. And without thinking about reality, you can still say, well, if you do this and this and that, you will be seeing satellites of that star, which is indeed, for all that we can do in addition in our observations, a satellite. It's not a star.
So if I understand that, and then when we enter a space of epistemological reflections, we reveal the foundations from which we do what we do and from which we claim what we claim. And at the same time, it contributes to us reorienting the manner in which we do what we do and also what we claim.
Exactly. It's that. Because all that we have is our living. And not our living as an abstract, in the doings of our living. When somebody asks you to make a statement and somebody asks you, how do you know? You answer with the doing. The doing in daily living. If you do this and this and this, then happens that. The problem arises when we have a theory or a doctrine as a background, as an explanatory doctrine of everything through God, for example, or the God architect that has designed everything. But it would remain in our daily living.
And in that sense, it's interesting because uh, when we reflect about our epistemology and we realize that it has to do with what we do and we are able to transform it, that means that the worlds that appears in front of us can also be transformed. Hence, the ontological level is a consequence of the epistemological reflections that we may be willing to step in or not.
Yes, but since whether we like it or not, we are speaking from our being, not conceptually, as by a being and doing, then the problem will not, though, the problem will arise only if there is some fundamental thinking about what is there, independently of what we do. And we cannot have access to anything independently of what we do.
Perfect. So by understanding that, then I realized that all expansion of awareness or consciousness will be one way or another the result of an conscious or unconscious expansion of our epistemological breadth.
Yeah. Change in our doings, expansion of the way we do. For example, whenever you make a reflection and you say, oh, now I understand. What has happened to you is that with that reflection, you saw more. Don't. Where in the world there, somebody will say yes, or in the domain of operation with your reflection and doings in your daily living.
And in which way there, because you said like, oh, I understand that is really filled with emotion, that distinction. Whoa, I understand. So what is the role of emotions, or how do emotions interact with our epistemological reflection?
Well, emotions appear in the sense that they allow you to open your vision or not. No, you don't have to reflect about that. It is this way. So this restricts your reflection. You said restricts you are looking at, but it's your reflection. It's you. I will don't look outside through the window. But whatever I do, looking or not looking, is what I do. So the reflection, what it does is leads you to release your attachment to some understanding. You release your attachment, and then you begin to see things that you could not see before because you were denied the possibility by having a truth. Could be God, could be reality, whatever.